Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. As you know, this year we are focusing on sustainability in scholarly publishing, including the humanities and beyond. And today we ask what the future looks like for scholarly and literary writing, given that generative AI is here to stay. Fire, the wheel, and writing. From the Rosetta Stone to Greek tragedy to the Bible, writing ranks highly among the defining technologies of human civilization. But new technologies risk upsetting the role of writing in human life. By now, we all know about artificial intelligence, from ChatGPT to DeepSeek, and recent debates about plagiarism in educational institutions. But what about the bigger picture? What is the purpose of writing? The question of AI in writing, in fact, contains a number of different components. AI can function as an editor, as an author, as a translator, or as a collaborator. And the risks and benefits of each of these is distinct. So what place does AI-generated writing hold, and what place should it hold in the lives of human writers? To help us make sense of all of this, we are joined by none other than Dr. Naomi Baron. She is author of the chapter AI and Human Writing, Collaboration or Appropriation, which is itself a chapter in the Gruyter Handbook of Robots in Society and Culture, published just last year by Gruyter Brill. Dr. Baron, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a delight being here.
I'm so happy to have you and so happy to dive into this fantastic topic and to leverage your expertise to shed some light on it. You write in your chapter something at the very beginning of the article, which was hugely clarifying to me. For all the talk of AI, I had never heard it before. And for me, it explained so much about the power and limitations of AI. You wrote that, quote, the most successful model for handling language generation and translation has been transformers, designed to spin out new text, feed it an opening sentence or two, and the program continues writing by drawing on a huge data set collected from the internet, Wikipedia, and books to predict the most likely next word and sentence. Today's transformers are coupled with large language models which contain the massive language data sets on which they draw. It is important that we remain aware of what language models can and cannot purport to quote unquote know. The data upon which they draw may be out of date, incomplete, or flat out wrong. And of course, the models themselves don't actually have knowledge. They simply draw upon text available online to generate new text, end quote. So I guess my first question, just to kick us off into the conversation, is artificial intelligence just a kind of souped up predictive text?
Sort of, yes. But there's a vast difference in the scope that's involved and the analytical ability that's involved with today's large language models. And there's a huge data set that's drawn upon. There are also a couple of subtle differences that I think are important to get out there. We all tend to talk about generative AI, using large language models, predicting the next word that's likely to come in a string of words. In actual fact, the technology uses a notion called tokens, which might be a whole word. It might be a piece of a word. It might be a couple of words together. It's a technicality, but it's important to know that words is convenient for us lay humans to think about, to use in discussing the technology, but that's not actually how it works. The major issue that has confounded not just the laity, but computer scientists themselves who created these models is that we don't understand what's going on under the hood, how the actual process of prediction is working. A really interesting paper just came out from Anthropic, one of OpenAI's and Google's and Meta's competitors with large language models. And it's been working to try to figure out what's actually happening. How step by step are the algorithms that are doing the predicting working? So I'd like to just talk through an example that came in an article that appeared a couple of days ago on what happened when Claude, which is the large language model, it goes through different iterations that Anthropic use. Claude was given the prompt, a rhyming couplet. He saw a carrot and had to grab it. Okay, so the question is, what's the next line going to be? The model responded, his hunger was like a starving rabbit. Okay, sounds like a couplet. Obviously, the next word to predict after the first line, he saw a carrot and had to grab it, the next word to predict was presumably his, as in his hunger was like a starving rabbit. But through various technologies that I will not pretend to be able to describe, through the technology that Anthropic was able to use, it discovered that what Claude was doing was hitting upon the word rabbit to rhyme with grab it before it hit upon his. Okay, that is, Claude had already hit upon the word rabbit when it was processing grab it from the first line of the couplet. That is, it seemed to be writing its next line, not with the next word in place in series, but the rhyme in place. Okay, so what does this tell us? We don't really know how the heck these models are working. We're just starting to figure it out. And it may take years before we have any good answers.
Your central question in the article is, quote, what place AI generated writing holds or should hold in the lives of human writers, end quote. And you seem to settle on an argument that, quote, choosing between human or AI as editor or writer need not be a zero-sum game. An alternative is collaboration, end quote. Is that a fair assessment? Have I understood correctly your argument?
Absolutely. And to be fair, it's not my argument. It's the one you'll hear from almost everybody who's seriously working on AI in a human context today. Not the ones who are saying AI will take over the world and we will be doing nothing ourselves and we will become the subjects of the overlords. Just the people who say, so what can we do with this technology? How do we appropriately augment, not automate? To take a phrase of Eric Brynjolfsson, who has done a lot of work at Stanford on using these models. Okay. So yes, collaboration, but we've got to figure out what we mean by collaborate. Are we talking about just doing a consultation? Are we talking about being co-creators? Are we talking about sometimes handing things over entirely? We have to know, what do we trust? And that's not just a question, trust from the AI. It's not just a question of hallucination from the AI. It's also a question of trusting that we want to hand over the ability to take our own stance, have our own perspective, have our own point of view. There's an important contrast to make that's been developing within the AI literature between what's called algorithm bias and algorithm aversion. That is, do you tend to believe what the algorithm, in this case an AI algorithm, is suggesting is right? Because after all, we're spending these billions of dollars in creating them, linked with these large data sets. Or do we feel, you know what, I'm not sure I trust that algorithm. The notion of bias first developed actually with the coming into being of commercial autopilot, where computers were starting to be used to do the steering, the takeoffs and the landings. And the question was, could you trust the computers to do it better than the human? Because we know that most of the airplane crashes have resulted from human error, not from mechanical error. But this becomes a big issue, and we don't have all the answers. What we know is there's lots of experimental data now showing that when you tell human beings that something was created by AI in a piece of writing, they tend to say the writing isn't as good as if a human did it, even if a human actually did that piece of writing. Okay, so there's a perception issue we have. There's a belief we have. There's also a question in terms of how much collaboration we do, of how much energy we want to expend, how much we're willing to expend on some kind of a cognitive task. There's been discussion now for at least a century, probably more, but at least in the technical literature, on how much effort you put forth. So there was a notion by a man named George Zip called the principle of least effort. In linguistics, you only put as much effort as you need to into words. There is the famous work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman on heuristics, saying much of the time in decision-making, we expend the minimal amount of effort necessary to make a decision, although sometimes we have to expend more. There's a theory of cognitive miser by psychologists saying you only put forth the effort you need to. So the question is, will AI and our increasing collaboration with it reduce the amount of effort, a mental, cognitive effort that we expend? Way back in not that far back, in 1983, a psychologist by the name of Lisanne Bainbridge wrote an article called Ironies of Automation. So we're not talking about AI in any serious sense at that point. And what she argued is for the kinds of mechanization that was happening in factories, if people no longer knew how to operate the machines themselves, those machines that were saving them time, and maybe producing more goods. But if the machine broke down, if the machine went wonky, would people any longer have the skills necessary to make the process work, to fix the machine? There was a really interesting study that came out just a couple of weeks ago, actually, largely done by researchers at Microsoft Research. So they care a lot about how much automation is being used in cognitive tasks. And their paper was called The Impact of Generative AI on Critical Thinking. To cut to the chase, what they found when they surveyed a huge number of people on what kinds of cognitive tasks they were allocating to AI as opposed to doing themselves, what they found is that people who believed that AI could do the job were putting less mental effort into doing the jobs themselves. But those people who had a lot of confidence in their abilities to think themselves were relying less on the AI. And the other really interesting across the board finding was, depending upon what kind of cognitive task was involved, people reported they were spending somewhere between around 65 and 70% less cognitive energy on thinking than they would have if they were doing the task themselves. That, to me, is troubling when we talk about collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there will have to be a fusion of behavioral sciences with researchers such as yourself focusing on AI, if the way that we use AI is so much determined by our own preconceived notions. I have a preconceived notion. I fall probably more into the camp of people who have more confidence in their own abilities as critical thinkers than in AI. My partner is a medical scientist and has long encouraged me to use AI tools and AI analysis to prepare and produce this podcast. They're probably more in the camp of the believers in AI. But, for the life of me, I just find it a fantastic waste of time when I give various AI tools, articles and chapters such as yours, and ask for summaries. I find it fails to pick out the absolutely most critical and most interesting details. When I ask it to suggest questions for the episode, I find them absolutely flat, uninteresting, robotic, for lack of a better word. You write a little bit about this in your article. You write, quote, "When writers use predictive texting, their vocabulary becomes more constrained, more succinct, and less interesting than when they were generating their own words. That's part of your section of the chapter talking about AI as an editor. On grammar and style, which are, there are various other AI tools in this area, you quote research by Anne Harrington and Charles Morin, who argue that these programs don't look at the text holistically, but only at the word and sentence level. And you say, quote, it presents the revising task to come as one of moving through categories and eliminating errors, not of rethinking the argument or adapting to a particular rhetorical situation, end quote. Although, as you say, we may not have insight into the exact mechanisms of the AI thought process, we can at least see from the outputs of these tools, we can infer a little bit of the limits of its functioning. That really seems to push hard your argument that there's no way AI could replace humans as writers. And so, therefore, it would very much seem to be a tool for humans to collaborate with. Would that be fair?
Let me pause for a second on the statement, there's no way that AI could replace humans. And I'd like to amend that to there's no way that AI should. And the reason I'll say that is the kinds of tools that are now evolving are scarily good. One of the things I insist on with my students whenever I'm reviewing a manuscript is looking at the date that something was written. The date, if I can find it, when the actual research was done. Go to the work of Anne Harrington and Charles Morin. Their article came out in 2012. The State of AI in 2012. 2012 is the year of the ImageNet contest when Geoffrey Hinton at the University of Toronto and some of his graduate students who have gone on to fame, and Geoffrey Hinton now has gotten himself a Nobel Prize, they won this contest using, I think it was 3 NVIDIA, maybe it was 1 or at most 3 NVIDIA chips that at that point were only used for graphics in games. That's ancient history, but incredibly important history. 2012, when this article was published saying, no, there's really very little useful in terms of grammar and style that we can do with these tools, that's no longer true. Let me give a couple of examples. One is a tool that Google created a little while ago, but called Google Notebook LM, LM for language model. And it was a way of dumping text, and now you can dump slides and graphs and that kind of stuff into it. And it would give you summaries, and it would generate questions you could ask, maybe for your podcast, who knows. But they also came out in fall 2024 with a tool called Audio Overview. When it first came out, the press talked about it being deep dive because what it did was created a, quotes, deep dive into text that was dumped into a notebook, but it was presented by 2 podcast hosts. They were AI generated, but they sounded pretty chirpy like humans because speech is something that AI does really well these days. So I decided to experiment, and I took the proposal that I had written for the book that I'm just now finishing. I took the proposal, it's a book on AI and reading, and I put it into a notebook for Audio Overview to present as a podcast. And it was eerily good. It was really frightening to hear a pretty good rendition of the content of what I had done. I then sent it to my editor, who had also read the proposal, needless to say. And what she said, and this was true, and I think this gets to the heart of what we really need to talk about. What she said is the accuracy was fine, but what was missing was my sense of humor, my personal voice, my anecdotes, because if you're trying to summarize, you don't ordinarily put in anecdotes. But that's part of what I try to do in terms of my own writing style. What's also the case is that if you use the right tool to do a specific right job, you can find all kinds of nuance and subtlety coming forth in the writing from these tools. So let me give you an example using Claude. So I put in, I wanted to play with how much ability the LLM had to adjust language levels and vocabulary levels. So I put in the prompt, write a 200-word plot summary of King Lear, but use sophisticated vocabulary. Okay? And it wrote, King Lear, a monarch of considerable sagacity, yet afflicted by hubris, orchestrates a fateful partition of his domain among his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. The allocation is to be predicated upon their respective declarations of filial devotion. Okay, it can do that. Then I asked to do the same thing, but write it in a way appropriate for a 12-year-old. Here comes. King Lear, an aging king, decides to split his kingdom among his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. He asks each of them to tell him how much they love him. Okay, that's sort of 12-year-old style. And then I went for broke, and I said, write me a humorous 200-word summary of King Lear. And here's how it started. Picture this. A cranky old king decides to play a game of who loves daddy most with his 3 daughters. The prize? Just a casual third of a kingdom. Okay, if it can do this, I have every reason to believe it's going to be able to pick up on humor in a summary. You can tweak it to do that now, but it doesn't do it automatically. So I'm not saying never to what the writing abilities are of these technologies. So what that means is we have to focus on the question of what do we as human beings care about when it comes to writing? What does writing do for us as people? In the last book that I did on AI and writing, I argued in the chapter on creativity that even if AI can do things that if we don't know who did it, we say are really creative, what matters about creativity is to us, for us, to us as creators. And I think that's important to keep in mind for darn sure when it comes to writing.
I did want to ask you about AI specifically in academia. The question of AI as a writer or an author seems to have generated the biggest debate in the public, in the media. The most TV show conversation has been focused on this area of AI, specifically in academia and its use there. One focus has been on, as you write about in the article, the racist or sexist biases in the models. You know, as they say, garbage in, garbage out. If it's trained on racist and sexist data sets, then obviously it will produce outputs based on its inputs. Another area of concern is what you mentioned earlier. You also write about this in an article, is this issue of hallucination, the way that AI just seems to make things up, which I now understand after having read your article, that the reason it does that is because it's set up as a kind of, forgive me for oversimplifying here, a glorified autocomplete. But I think that the biggest focus of all, arguably one could say it's been a moral panic, seems to be around the question of students and the authenticity of educational experience and assessment. You write that, quote, determined students figure out that by tweaking what AI produces, adding a couple of typographical errors or an ungrammatical sentence, replacing common words with less frequently used vocabulary, incorporating an opinion or local information that would not be in the machine's data set, they can make AI-generated text sound as if they had done the work themselves, end quote. That sounds like a kind of collaboration between students and AI. So what's wrong with that?
You know, if you have 2 people who want to rob a bank and one is doing the robbing, the other has the getaway car, that's collaboration. So don't assume that collaboration by itself is golden. But I think we need to talk about two kinds of issues when it comes to heavy collaboration with AI. The first is, what is our motive? And the second is, what are the consequences? So let's talk about motive first. What kind of writing are we trying to produce? If you're writing advertising copy, or if you're the sports writer for your school newspaper, and there are 12 teams and they're all played that Saturday, and you need to get the articles out because you have homework that's due and you have a date you'd really like to go on Sunday night, and you just want to get it done, that doesn't bother me so much. On the other hand, if you're asked to craft an essay on whether or not you believe in the death penalty, I don't mind you using an AI research tool to find sources that you then read, but then you've got to do the bulk of the work yourself. We need to think about what the consequences are of turning the writing that we do, whether that's students or whether it's professionals or whether it's us in just our everyday life, of turning us into post-editors rather than initiators and finishers. So there's an analogy that I give of what's happening with professional translators. Professional translators are very proud of their abilities. And one of the things that's happening because of cost is particularly corporations that want a lot of translation done are now doing it by machine translation and relegating human translators to become post-editors. You interview these people and they'll tell you that basically the soul has gone out of their job. You also lose by doing too much collaboration such that you're reduced to post-editor. You lose your opportunities to write, to read, and to think. Okay, and it's pretty clear from the Microsoft study, almost all the authors of which were at Microsoft, that people spoke about not feeling that they were any longer doing the cognitive work. They were relegated to what I will call, they didn't, but I will call the scut work, which means getting better prompts and figuring out how to massage the message so it fits your company's goals for that particular project. That's different from figuring out how do you approach a task? How do you try it out? How do you fail and then redo? So an analogy that I keep thinking about is one that happened to me from an event that happened to me when I was in graduate school. I had written a paper for a course, and the professor had said, you know, it's really good. You might consider publishing it, but it needs some revision. So I spent a whole summer revising, and I was so proud of the work I did, and I gave it back to this professor, and she said, no. She said, you need to rethink. And what she advised me to do, which is the smartest advice I have ever gotten for, quotes, revising a piece, is to take, at that point, it was a pad of paper, this is a number of decades back, and a pen, and go sit somewhere where you have no sources and you don't have your original copy, and redo from start. And it turned out to be a much better paper, and yes, it got published and all that kind of good stuff. What I do now when I write a proposal for a book chapter or for a book itself, is I write it and then I stash it away and I go somewhere else and I think through the problem again. I want to say, what is this really about? And I realize I didn't know the first time around. And had I just tweaked what I wrote, forget about if AI wrote it, I wouldn't have come out in as productive a place.
Drafting and redrafting as part of the process, not just editing. Yeah, I hear that. In a similar vein, you say in the chapter, quote, grades and learning are not the same, end quote. And you come up with some solutions which are focused on ensuring educational experience. One of them is writing essays by hand, especially in class, and also oral assignments. In the article, you're actually a little bit against these solutions. You find them impractical and that they risk depriving students of the learning that comes with written assignments if we were to switch to oral assignments. But If the moral panic we've been seeing around AI in academia has been focused on the validity of academic qualifications, meaning specifically academic assessment, not necessarily educational experience, but academic assessment specifically, then wouldn't these solutions make more sense? For example, essays written under supervision or oral exams as a means of validating academic qualifications of the individual as separate from their collaboration or use of AI tools. Wouldn't these proposals that you mentioned actually go some way to resolving those concerns?
It's complicated. To be fair, the ideas of oral assignments and doing writing in class didn't originate with me. They came out in the press, at least in the United States, over and again, right after ChatGPT was first launched, end of November 2022. But let's look at the ideas themselves. The problem really is, and I'll speak largely for the United States, but I know this applies to other parts of the world as well. The problem is one of pragmatics. If you have a class that has 100 people in it, which often exists in universities I've been taught in, such as my own American University in Washington, or I taught for a semester at the University of Modena. And I know that in a lot of Italian universities, there are 300 people in a class. And they actually sometimes have oral exams. Guess what? They're 10 or 15-minute exams. The professors are exhausted. How much can you assess a student having worked all semester or even all year in 15 minutes of questioning when the person who's the professor is doing this over and again? Okay, there's limited class time if you want to talk about writing an essay in class. Beyond that, at least in the United States, regrettably, many students have very limited handwriting abilities because they are put onto keyboards really early in their educational life. So the legibility issue was a challenge even when I was an undergraduate, if you're writing under pressure. But for darn sure, it's even more of a problem now because, number one, most students in the United States don't know cursive. We know cursive was invented in order to make writing faster. So if you can't use cursive, it's slower. They don't know how to hold a pen for an extended period of time. So making that work would be hard. At least in the United States, there's very, very little experience with oral exams. There's an interesting historical shift that took place. Again, I'll speak about American higher education from oral recitation, including oral exams, to a written culture where things, including exams, became written. And that's the way people have been raised. So suddenly saying, we don't want you to cheat, and therefore we're going to make you do an oral exam, even if we had the time, it's not going to work. Okay. But what's important, at least again in the US, is this challenge of ChatGPT and other kinds of LLMs has raised the question in the educational community of what's our goal in these writing assignments anyway? What is it we're trying to get students to do? Because the vast majority of writing assignments are not read very carefully by their faculty, who say, I'm not a writing instructor. I will sort of see how the content is, and I'll stick a grade on it, maybe a couple of comments if you're lucky, you student. And unless we actually care about nurturing students' writing abilities and devoting the financial resources to hiring enough people who have the abilities and the interests in working through multiple drafts with students, talking through their ideas, then our current model of writing, even if there were no AI tools that might compromise human authenticity, it wouldn't make any difference. So we have to decide what our educational goals are before we worry too much about the cheating part. Also, I think it's important to know that some preliminary studies have suggested that the amount of cheating that students are doing using AI to do the writing for them is probably not much greater than the amount of cheating that students had been doing previously, because yes, students, I'll only speak for the statistics in the States, but I know it happens elsewhere. There are data for that too. People buy papers from paper mills, they commission friends, they borrow papers from a previous course and instructor and so forth. The question is, how do we respond educationally? Well, we've got to figure out what the difference is between using AI appropriately and inappropriately. There was just a study that Gallup poll published a day or two ago suggesting that college students really want their institutions to tell them what's appropriate use of AI and what's not, but they feel those institutions are not giving advice. And I empathize with the institutions because the goalposts shift almost day by day as to what the tools can do. So setting up a policy today for what's going to be used 2 months from now may be out of date already. We also know that one of the ways that some institutions are responding are saying, use AI as much as you want, just tell us if you've used it. The prime example I like to give is Arizona State University's College of Law now lets students who are applying to do their application essay using AI. And the only thing you have to do is disclose that you've done it. Because they know that people are using these tools, so why not be honest about it? At the same time, Duke University has recently decided that for the college application essays that students are required to write in applying to be undergraduates at Duke, Duke will no longer judge the quality of the writing of those essays because it says, we have no idea if a student wrote it, if a parent wrote it, if AI wrote it. So we're just going to look at the content that's talked about. We're not going to look at writing quality anymore because we throw up our hands and we know we can't trust. Maybe the student did it, maybe the student didn't, but because we have no way of knowing, we're wasting our time trying to figure it out.
Wow. So universities on the one hand are, in the face of AI, discarding writing quality as a metric of evaluation.
At least this one for this purpose, and see where this goes.
And on the other hand, you're proposing that we devote more financial resources to improving academic writing, which I think every academic on planet Earth would be in favor of an improvement in the quality of an academic writing workforce to read, which is some of the things we have to read sometimes are not so readable. But one of the reasons I broached this topic of the questions of AI in academic assessment is because I'm thinking about the cultural moment that we're in the much bigger context of late capitalism and the growing public perception in a number of countries, especially Western countries, that higher education is a kind of scam. And to be fair, I understand that argument because higher education really has been pitched to us for so many decades now as a means of class mobility. And it's really been, as a tool for class mobility, its usefulness has really been mitigated over the past couple of decades. In the United States, tuition fees are just so high that by and large only wealthy or insanely indebted people can access it now. In Europe, the approach is a little bit different. It's more about elongating the timelines of study and requiring all kinds of related unpaid or extremely poorly paid internships during or at the end of that educational career, for which only the children of extremely wealthy families can afford to be out of work for so many years of their life. The end result is so much the same. In either case, the trend is for entry into a position in the academic world, increasingly being something, a goal achievable more and more to children of families within the upper and middle classes of their respective countries. But the broader culture, and bear with me because it's a bit of a convoluted argument, but what I'm trying to say here is that phenomenon is happening on the one hand. But on the other hand, we still have this broader cultural attribution of a university degree as some sort of designator or indicator of meritocratic success or intelligence or expertise. So the critique is between these two phenomenon is that the culture says the universities are a marker of meritocratic success, but in practice, it's increasingly a marker of belonging to an economic or financial aristocracy. And because the broader cultural claim about the symbolic value of university degrees is still contested, it makes sense to me that there is a kind of moral panic with a lot of the media focusing specifically on the implications of AI for the validity of academic certificates. Because if their validity comes under increasing cultural pressure, then the system of university degrees as tools in this cultural process begins to break down. And therefore, the moral panic is really more around that than necessarily how AI is going to change our lives. On this matter, what would you make of that reading of how these AI developments have been talked about in the media?
Let me draw on an additional area of my expertise, namely the history of higher education in America, with a dabbling in history of higher education in other parts of the world. It's a multifaceted story that's historically dynamic. And I think we need to think about the different stages of approaches to higher education because they have different stories to tell. I'll also remind us, just because most of my story is about the US, but I'll remind us there are red brick universities in the UK for a reason, right? It's not all Oxford and Cambridge. Okay. In the United States, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, there was a concerted move to democratize higher education. There was something called the Morrill Act of 1862, which established what are called land-grant colleges, and they were for agricultural and mechanical training. They were for doing pragmatic things above a high school level so that knowledge could be put to pragmatic uses. In the late 1930s, the then president of Harvard University, James Conant, was very intent on providing scholarships to Harvard for deserving students, but he didn't know how to identify them. So he and various of his colleagues were responsible for what became the SAT, which was established as a test that presumably tested aptitude. It probably tests achievement, and now they just call it the SAT, not the aptitude test. But it was there for the explicit purpose of providing chances for people who didn't come from upper middle class or wealthy backgrounds to go into higher education. Community colleges were established, and a number of states in the United States now have made them completely free, and their tuition is not large. Private universities, including some of the better endowed ones, not only give tuition support. So the majority of undergraduates who are going to an American private university are not paying full tuition. There are schools now that are saying if your family has an income of up to $200,000 US a year, you get free tuition. So there have been a lot of moves to ask, how can we get more students who don't have financial means to be able to attend some of our strong universities? Now, it's also true that within the United States, again, I'll focus here, that the confidence in higher education shifts politically. There's an interesting truism, unfortunately, that a number of conservatives, politically conservatives, believe that the term liberal arts refers to liberal politics, which it doesn't. Barack Obama was very intent in making it possible for more people to get a four-year college degree. On the other hand, thinking pragmatically, both politically and economically, President Joe Biden at the time said, you don't need a college degree to get a good job. Maybe it would be a 2-year college degree, maybe as opposed to 4 years. Maybe it would be certificates. Maybe it would be some kind of training program that begins in high school. And now there are a lot of really good training programs that begin in high school. That leaves out the liberal arts part of one's education, which I think is to a lot of people's, let me amend that, to everyone's detriment. The United States has seen a shift from this model of learning to live, that is for the purpose of having a better life, not monetarily, but in terms of one's soul, in terms of what one knows, in terms of how one interacts in the world. We're shifting from that model, it's true, to one of learning having its purpose to make a living. And that's been very much linked to the economic prospects of the country at the time. So if you go back to the 1960s, one of the most common, probably the most popular for a period of time, major, that is field of concentration for study of undergraduates, was psychology. People wanted to understand themselves. Right up there was literature. People understood that by reading literature, you could understand yourself and society and the world. What are the most popular majors now? Economics, computer science, business. Literature is way down on the list. Even psychology is not doing so well. So when we come back to the question of the value of a college degree, we also have to ask, what is it about that degree that is taken as mattering? Is it the school you go to, regardless of how well you did? Is it the grades you get? Interestingly, because of the huge amount of grade inflation in the United States, a lot of employers don't take grades seriously. They want to know what you did. Did you do internships? They want to know what skills you have. And I think when we talk about moral panic and we talk about education not being worth it and it's only for the meritorious, we've really got to look at the much more complex tapestry before coming to conclusions.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying on the inherent value of education and the shift towards higher education as a means for employment. I grew up in Canada in the late 90s, and back then tuition fees were just beginning to go up. And I remember the debates back then were around the purpose of universities and education more broadly. There's also this discourse in the air around the free market and efficiency. And there were still voices arguing against those values and for the central place of education, specifically in a democratic society, the kind of argument you just set out. But I've not heard those arguments in a long time. They're just not out there. I mean, you just made it now, but it's unusual to hear that kind of thing. People aren't arguing for liberal arts education and increasing meaning and self-understanding and self-awareness through education in our lives, and the importance of that for broader societal cohesion or functioning. Do you think there might be room in the debates around AI to open up space for these kinds of arguments? Or are we so deep into that trend you describe of higher education as just a means to secure employment, meaning so deep into neoliberalism, really, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of education as job training?
The answer depends in part upon which institutions you're looking at. And I also do want to get to AI for sure. If you look at liberal arts, in the traditional sense of liberal arts, colleges these days, what you find is a really interesting mix between, on the one hand, a focus on how important the career center is, how important doing internships so that you can prepare for a job, but also a lot of discussion of what goes by the name critical thinking. It's one of those squishy terms that doesn't have any really good definition that people agree upon. And it started way back when, in the early part of the 20th century, to essentially refer to logical thinking and logic as a discipline itself. It's now changed its meaning a lot. But that discourse has not gone away. And although statistically, I think the number of institutions, again, I can only authoritatively speak, I think authoritatively for the United States, number of institutions that are talking about these values is small. It's not minuscule. Now, that said, as I don't have to say, And I won't say any more about what's happening in higher education in America, given what's happened politically in America. Lord knows what the world is going to look like in institutions, even 6 months to a year from now, in terms of the kinds of discussion that's encouraged. But at least there are a number of institutions that are saying, I'm not folding. It is important for us to have inquiry because we make for better human beings. We make for better societies. If you want people to be able to vote responsibly, they have to be able to read, to think, to assess for themselves. Okay, so now the for themselves gets it to be the segue into AI. Beginning with popularization of the internet, before we were really thinking about AI and tools like Google AI Overviews, which is Gemini as a search tool, as it were, people were already starting to say, you know what do I need to go to class for? They weren't yet saying, what do I need to go to college? What would I need to go to class for? Because I can get all the information I need online. What do I need to read books for? I can get that online. Now that we have really good informational summarizing tools with AI that do a terrific job on books, by the way, they may miss out on my humor and my nuance, but informationally, they do a pretty darn good job. There, I think, is going to be the question of what do we want higher education of any sort to be? A couple of years ago, there was a professor, I think at the Harvard School of Education, if I'm remembering correctly, who said, given at that point he was talking more about the internet than AI, he was saying we need to move our goalposts from seeking information to developing knowledge and wisdom. And he's right. How many institutions will take that as their goals? How many can afford to take that as their goals? Will students come for those purposes? I don't know. But I think we have an obligation to dig our heels in and to say we have to figure out what our rationale is for being a university. Back in 1852, Cardinal John Henry Newman wrote The Idea of a University. And this was a kind of proposal for what a Catholic university in Ireland should be. And its goals were the ability to analyze and reason and extend the mind. Well, that sounds very lofty, and you say, come on, it's a century and a half ago. But universities, in principle, are the only place left to us to nurture these values. And I think we have an obligation to figure out how to keep doing that.
We've done it again. Dr. Baron and I had such a stimulating, in-depth conversation about artificial intelligence and the future of human writing that the Sustainability Matters team and I wanted to share it with you in full as a special double episode. So in this first half, we've been seeking to better understand AI's internal mechanisms, its function in higher learning, and the moral panics around its involvement in educational assessment. Stand by now for the second half because we get into what AI means for academic publishing, academic bureaucracy, fiction writing, and what Dr. Baron thinks Karl Marx would say about the rise of the machines. Stay with us.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.